So we're all pretty aware at this point that there are a lot of live action anime adaptations, and a lot of them are awful. There's a few reasons so many of them are bad, but honestly that's a whole different video that probably takes 10 to 15 minutes on its own to fully cover, so another day. For now though, I actually want to take a look at some of these adaptations because there are a few hidden gems underneath all the shovelware in this niche movie medium. One of these gems happens to be JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Diamond is Unbreakable Chapter 1, a 2017 live action adaptation of Part 4 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Actually, gem might not be the best word. There's a bit of a nuance to this whole review I'm about to do, but we'll get there. Having had not seen or heard anything about this adaptation up until about a year ago, and knowing that this is an Eastern adaptation, not a Western one, I actually came into this with zero expectations, for better or for worse. I was a little confused as to why, out of all parts, the decision was made to adapt Part 4, but when I sat and thought about it, and it started to make more and more sense as I watched the movie. It made the most sense to me at first to obviously just start at the very beginning of the series and adapt Part 1, but the more I thought about that and the more I think about people calling it, well, the worst part, they probably went, Part 1's not that popular, so we don't really want to adapt that. And Parts 2 and 3 have very travel heavy plots, and so there would have been like a lot of different sets they would have had to go through, and more sets means more money, and I'm sure the budget for this film wasn't the biggest. So with all those things considered, that brings us to adapting Part 4. And before we deep dive in, let me say, as a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fan, this is cool, but I don't think it works as a good adaptation, and I'll explain why more towards the end. The movie's runtime is just under 2 hours, and to my surprise, is paced pretty well and on par with the anime and manga. While Chapter 1 is in the title, I was still pretty pessimistic to the idea they weren't going to rush or skim over things for the most part, even if they were literally setting up the fact that there were going to be multiple movies to adapt this part of JoJo's. The few liberties they do take in this film always, for the most part, were understandable decisions to seemingly enhance the overall transition from anime and manga to live action. Still think some of them felt pointless, but hey, it is what it is. The movie opens up with us seeing an attempted arrest of Angelo, who, if you don't remember, was the stand user at the very beginning of Part 4, who had the stand that could possess the properties of any liquid, and he would use that to, well, forcefully enter people's body and attack them from the inside. He escapes from the police only to be shot in the neck with the stand arrow by Nijimuro while running through an alley. I'm not going to point out every difference between the movie and anime or movie and manga, because that's not why I want to look at live action adaptations of anime, but I'm pointing this out to show that this isn't a one-to-one recreation. I'm guessing they use this as a leading introduction because it's a little bit more action-packed and attention-grabbing than simply watching Jotaro ride into the city while listening to a radio. While in the manga and anime, they do tease Kira a little bit, like for like half a second. I'm guessing the directors and the writers felt like there was no need to point that part in the movie because, well, Kira's just not here. So the movie covers the first few chapters of the manga and about 4 episodes of the anime. So Nijimuro is positioned as like the main antagonist of the film instead of slightly alluding to Kira's existence. Immediately, something that stood out with him being shot through his neck is that the movie does not hold back on the violence, like, at all. It's not hostile or anything, but watching this adaptation really shows how easy it is to dilute violence through animation. By the way, if you didn't get the hostile reference, it's just a messed up movie. Don't watch it. Like, please don't watch it. I have no clue how this guy hasn't made it to a watch list yet. Don't watch that movie. Anyway, after this, we get introduced to our movie version of Koichi, 0 out of 10, way too tall. My gripes about the characters pretty much are all relatively the same. Some characters fall more victims to this issue than others, but again, I'll get there. Koichi runs into a couple of bullies and Josuke walks by, accidentally bumping one of the bullies, and the bully then insults Josuke's hair, and then we get a quick glance at Josuke's stand as he beats the bullies up and then quickly heals them after. We then see Josuke stop the guy that holds the woman at knife point outside of the convenience store. Then we see Josuke have his face off with Jotaro, meet him, have this whole explanation about why Jotaro's showing up and who Jotaro is. And from there, the movie pretty much plays out relatively similar to how you would think as a person who's read or watched JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 4. Like I said, there are a few hiccups here and there in terms of differences. Like the first time we're introduced to Okuyasu, it's not while Josuke and Koichi are walking to school together. Instead, it's while Koichi and Yukigo are walking home from school together. Or like when Josuke has the confrontation with the bullies in the beginning of the movie, Jotaro's not there at all. In fact, Jotaro's pretty far removed from the scene, as you don't see Jotaro for like another 15 to 20 minutes after this moment. But all in all, none of these decisions really add or subtract anything from the adaptation. I'm sure a lot of these choices were made for a very specific reason, but it not hurting the movie makes them a bit irrelevant to me. Pacing is a hard thing to get right in a story when you're creating something purely from scratch, so I can't imagine the headache it is when you're translating something 2 times over. It's just one of those things. The movie's big final battle comes to a close with the confrontation Josuke and Koichi have against the Nijimuru brothers, and I gotta be honest, pretty cool. Like I said, I didn't really have any expectations, and I had no clue how they were going to go about pulling off the look and the feel of the stands and all of these wacky things that happen in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But relatively speaking, in the special effects department, I feel like they did a pretty good job. Every time we hear stands described in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, it sounds a little something like the characters referring to them as ghosts or spirits, and I really feel like they held that in place with the adaptation. They have this weird transparent effect to them, and besides this moment when Josuke is using Crazy Diamond head on against Bad Company, they make sure never to let the stands linger on screen too much, which is appreciated. Less is more, and that's definitely a rule that helped the effects department of this movie. The entire visual representation as a whole, honestly, is pretty good, from costume design and effects down to the sets of each scene and how much care seemingly was put into making them look as visually similar to the manga as possible. This movie really tried its best to get all the style and fast-paced action from JoJo's onto the big screen, and it was genuinely really cool as a JoJo's fan. But that leads us to the bad and why I think this is a cool movie but a poor adaptation. Usually when we're pointing out a bad adaptation, it's because the translation to a big screen usually causes the story to lose its heart and soul, like Death Note or Dragon Ball Evolution. Don't worry, sadly, we'll get there. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Daiyamondo's Unbreakable Chapter 1, holy hell, that is an insanely long title, doesn't lose the heart of JoJo's that much, but that's only half the battle when we're talking about an adaptation. Touching on a problem I had with the writing and the tone of the characters not feeling like themselves, I do think that was a bit of an issue, but seeing as how this movie literally was able to cover only about 4 episodes of the anime, and it literally having chapter 1 in the subtitle, meaning there were going to be at least one more movie at some point, I can kind of live with that. Maybe the directors and the writers chose to keep the characters in their simplest form for this first iteration and planned on slowly flushing them out as time went on. And truthfully, none of the characters suffered too much, but one character suffers from it really, really bad. And it's arguably the most important character, Josuke. In short, he just way too serious. His introduction in the movie compared to his introduction in the anime alone lets me know the writers and director decided on a much different tone for him in this movie. I've already explained the scene in the movie when he's first introduced, and they have this hard hip-hop track playing in the background as he's walking in slow motion, and they're putting this real deep bass rumble effect with every step he takes as we slowly pan up to him, making this mean grin. Like, this shot is very much so done in a way to make him seem as menacing as possible. Versus the anime and manga, when we first see Josuke, he's literally watching a turtle and he starts talking to the bullies about his fear and how he's trying to get over his fear of turtles. I don't know, it just feels like the movie inverted Josuke's character. In the manga and the anime, Josuke very much so comes across as like this goofy kid who, when he needs to, or who if you push him far enough, can turn very, very serious. But it seems like in the movie, they wanted his characterization to be serious the majority of the time, and he has slight moments where he can be chill and a goofy high schooler. It's a real issue. It even kind of hurts the whole Josuke insult his hair gag, because instead of it being like this impactful standout moment where you can see a clear black and white depiction between Josuke's character, it kind of just comes across in the movie like he's a bit of a dick, and that his appearance and his hair is so important to him because he's just a giant dickhead that if you insult it, he's gonna beat you up. The short and easiest way I can put it is Josuke doesn't feel like Josuke in this movie. He feels like a mini Jotaro, and that does nothing but make him feel more bland than he should. I'm okay with Koichi feeling like he's a bit too shy and too reserved. I'm okay with Yukiko feeling like she's a little bit too much of a yandere. I'm okay with Okuyasu feeling like he's a bit too much of an idiot, because at the end of the day, that's how those characters were introduced, and this is the beginning of them adapting that story. But Josuke doesn't evolve into a more laid back guy. He's always a laid back guy. He's a direct differing character from the past part in Jotaro. Jotaro was serious pretty much all the time. Josuke is someone that was supposed to be laid back pretty much all the time, and it was supposed to be a bit of a homage to Joseph, his dad, and them having similar personalities and goofy, wacky quirks. Looking past my issue with the characterization of some of the characters on screen though, the live adaptation just doesn't really capture any of the style or the flash of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and obviously that's really hard to do. But in this case, I feel like it's something that really needs to be pointed out, because style and flash is like literally like 40% of the enjoyment of JoJo's. And that may seem like it's harsh and it seems like I'm being unfair, because how do you create a live adaptation that's still going to have all the style and flash and visual flair of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? And to that I say, you're right. It is not a fair bar to set. But at the same time, maybe that means that this adaptation shouldn't exist. So in my opinion, just to clear what makes a good and bad adaptation, I think for something to be a good adaptation, it needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, separate from leaning on its source material too much. Just in my opinion, if I have to read a book or play a game or watch another movie to enjoy the adaptation of something else, then the adaptation simply isn't that good. I recently saw in the news that The Last of Us, supposedly, I haven't seen it myself, but I haven't played the game either, so it doesn't really matter, has a great adaptation of the Last of Us game. And people who have never played the Last of Us video games are really enjoying that series. It can stand on its own. Same goes for the MCU movies. Despite the turning opinion on those, for a very long time, those movies had shown that, hey, if you don't read comic books or see other comic book movies or watch any comic book or superhero TV shows, you can still pop into the MCU and become a fan of comics, because they're strong enough from their source material to stand on their own 2 feet. I don't think this is a bad movie. I just think it's a failed adaptation, because to get the most enjoyment out of this movie, you need to have already been a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fan. This isn't going to turn anyone. And ultimately, I think that's the point of an adaptation. This movie should allow JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fans to exist without them having to interact with the manga or the anime. And ultimately, it just doesn't do that. Generally speaking, if I were to show someone this movie, they might enjoy it, but I doubt they would become this huge JoJo's fanatic. It didn't necessarily lose its heart and soul in the translation from manga and anime to movie, but it losing a lot of its style, a lot of its flash, really makes this film come across less like this wacky, cool adventure with this very interesting and dynamic power system in shonen, and more like just these super powered high schoolers who are fighting each other. I don't know. I would have been curious to see how this would have played out. they said chapter 1, meaning there had to at least be a chapter 2. But as I said, they only covered about 4 episodes of the anime in this movie. So coming in at an equal runtime at about 2 hours, I'd be very surprised if they wouldn't have had to stretch this thing out to at least 4 or maybe even 5 movies to fully cover part 4. But even with that said, I would have been interested to see it. I would have been invested. But I think that investment comes more out of already appreciating JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and less because this is some new thing in a new medium that's here to succeed. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Diamond is Unbreakable Chapter 1 is a nice love letter if you're really into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but it doesn't really work all that great as an adaptation. And that's the end of the video. If you liked, like it. If you have something to say, comment, and if you want to see more, subscribe. I make videos of this quality or better all the time. I am leaving.